Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each will send chills down your spine. What you're about to hear is intense. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The air hung heavy with humidity as 15-year-old Abby Peterson joined the rest of her campmates from Camp Cumbay on what was supposed to be a simple caving adventure. It was the morning of August 2nd, 2004, and today's destination was Island Ford Cave in Virginia. With excitement bubbling in her chest, Abby had slipped on her helmet, adjusted her headlamp, and listened attentively as the counselors explained the safety precautions. No one could have predicted how drastically the day would change. Island Ford Cave was well known among local spelunking enthusiasts. The camp had been bringing teenagers through its more accessible sections for years without serious incident. Tom Watson, the lead counselor for today's expedition, had traversed these passages dozens of times. His confidence was reassuring as he guided the group of 8 teenagers into the yawning entrance of the cave. As they descended, the summer heat faded with each step, replaced by the cave's natural coolness. For the first hour, the adventure went exactly as planned. The group squeezed through passages that required them to turn sideways, experiencing the unique thrill that comes from exploring spaces untouched by sunlight. Abby, who had been looking forward to this trip since the first day of camp, took careful steps over the uneven floor, mindful of Tom's warnings about loose stones and slippery surfaces. As they ventured deeper, about 500 feet, approximately 152 meters from the entrance, the passage narrowed into a breakdown area. Here, the ceiling had partially collapsed at some point in the distant past, creating a jumble of rocks and crevices that required careful navigation. The space became a natural obstacle course of jagged edges and uncertain footing. Abby was fourth in line, following close behind Tom and 2 other campers. Her headlamp illuminated the path just enough to see a few feet ahead. The breakdown area required them to step carefully from one rock to another. Some stones were solidly anchored, others wobbled treacherously under weight. Tom demonstrated the safest path, pointing out stable footholds. When Abby's turn came to cross, she placed her foot on what appeared to be a secure stone. Without warning, the rock shifted beneath her weight. In an instant, her world tilted sideways. Her arms windmilled frantically as she tried to regain balance, but then she started falling. It wasn't a long drop, perhaps 3 feet, about 91 centimeters, but she landed awkwardly between 2 large rocks. The impact of her fall triggered a secondary disaster. The unstable rock formation above her, disturbed by her weight and movement, began to give way. Several stones, ranging from fist-sized to ones weighing nearly 20 pounds, 9 kilograms, broke loose from the cave walls. Abby barely had time to cover her head with her arms before the rocks came crashing down around her. One struck her helmet with enough force to crack the plastic. When the brief rockfall subsided, Abby found herself partially buried. Stones covered her torso and left arm, while her legs were stretched out and stuck. The weight on her chest made each breath a conscious effort, the pressure squeezing her ribs with every inhalation. The initial pain wasn't severe, more surprising than anything. Then came the horrible realization. Not only was she partially buried under a layer of rocks, but her right leg was trapped between 2 immovable boulders. She twisted her body, trying to pull free, but found herself pinned from multiple directions. Her leg was stretched out at an uncomfortable angle, wedged from mid-calf to ankle. The weight of the situation crashed down on her, along with the crushing awareness of the millions of tons of earth and stone above her head. Her breathing quickened as panic began to rise like floodwater in her chest. The cave, which had seemed magical just moments before, now felt like a stone prison closing in around her. Tom reacted immediately, scrambling carefully to her side. First, he needed to free her from the blanket of rocks that covered much of her body from top. With everyone's help, they were able to remove the rock that was burying her. And then one by one, he carefully removed the stones from her torso, working methodically from smallest to largest. Each removed stone allowed Abby to draw slightly deeper breaths, but the relief was minimal as long as her leg remained trapped. His experienced eyes quickly understood the problem. Beyond the rocks covering her body, Abby's leg was thoroughly wedged in a narrow crevice, with the awkward angle preventing her from getting enough leverage to pull herself free. The fallen rocks had only complicated the situation, pinning her body in a position that made escape nearly impossible. The pain intensified as the initial shock wore off. It wasn't just the sharp agony where rocks had struck her body, but also the persistent grinding discomfort of flesh pressed against the stone. Worse was the creeping numbness that began in her toes and slowly spread upward, a warning sign that circulation was being compromised. Tom tried everything his training had prepared him for. He attempted to shift the smaller of the two main rocks trapping her leg, but found it was part of a larger formation, immovable without proper tools. He tried to create more space by clearing smaller stones from around her trapped limb, but the critical points of pressure remained. He even attempted to use his body as a counterweight to give Abby better leverage, but each attempt only seemed to wedge her leg more firmly in place. Meanwhile, the other teenagers huddled nearby. Some offered encouragement, others stood in stunned silence. The temperature of the cave, which had felt pleasantly cool before at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, now seemed to seep into Abby's bones with malevolent intent. Time behaved strangely underground. What might have been 15 minutes felt like hours as Tom made one attempt after another to free her. Abby's initial panic had settled into a numb resignation, punctuated by waves of discomfort whenever she shifted position. The moisture from the cave floor had soaked through her jeans, adding the misery of cold dampness to her predicament. After exhausting all immediate options, Tom made a difficult decision. He instructed Julie, the assistant counselor, to take the shortest route back to the surface and call for emergency rescue. The waiting was perhaps the worst part. Each minute stretched painfully. Abby's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would they need to break her leg to free her? Would she be trapped for days? The thoughts spiraled darker as time wore on. Above ground, Julie sprinted to the nearest vehicle, fumbling with shaking hands to retrieve the emergency phone. The local rescue dispatcher answered on the second ring, and Julie explained the situation and location. The rural Virginia county maintained a specialized cave rescue team for exactly such emergencies. Within 20 minutes of Julie's call, volunteers were assembling equipment and converging on Island Ford Cave from all directions. These weren't ordinary first responders, but specially trained cave rescuers with intimate knowledge of underground rescue techniques. Back in the darkness, Abby had fallen into a strange state between wakefulness and exhaustion. The first sign of rescue came nearly an hour after Abby's fall, a distant call followed by the welcome sight of multiple headlamps bobbing in the darkness. Julie had returned, leading 4 members of the cave rescue team directly to their location. They carried specialized equipment. The team leader immediately took charge of the situation. After assessing both the trapped leg and the injuries from the fallen rocks, he pulled out a small toolkit containing specialized wedges and spreaders designed for precisely this type of extraction. Working methodically, he inserted a series of progressively larger wedges between the rocks constraining Abby's leg, creating spaces that, combined, gradually reduced the pressure. After 20 minutes of careful work, the rescuer was able to create just enough space, barely half an inch, about 1.3 centimeters, for the paramedic to apply a lubricant gel around Abby's trapped leg. With this final assistance and a coordinated effort from 3 team members pulling at precisely the right angle, Abby's leg finally slipped free from its stone prison. The relief was immediate but short-lived. As blood rushed back into her leg, Abby experienced pain more intense than anything during the entrapment itself. Additionally, now that she was free from the leg trap, the team could properly assess the injuries caused by the fallen rocks. Multiple contusions along her back and shoulders, with one particularly concerning area on her left shoulder blade, where the skin had been broken and was now seeping blood. They carefully transferred Abby to the specialized stretcher, securing her body to prevent any movement that might cause further injury in the narrow confines of the cave passages. The journey out was slow. The stretcher needed to be passed hand over hand through the tightest sections. When they finally emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, an ambulance waited nearby, its rear doors open in anticipation. At the hospital, doctors conducted thorough examinations concerned about potential compartment syndrome, a dangerous condition where pressure builds within muscles, potentially leading to permanent damage. They were equally worried about internal injuries from the impact of falling rocks, particularly around her ribcage where stones weighing up to 20 pounds 9 kilograms, had rested. X-rays confirmed no fractures in her leg, but revealed 2 hairline fractures in her ribs. She was able to make a full recovery in the following days. In the hills of Vermont, Albertson's quarry sits as a remnant of old mining operations. Over the years, groundwater filled the abandoned mine, turning it into a popular spot for cave divers. On May 29, 2005, Tim Gagnon, 43, and his diving partner John Weymouth arrived at the quarry that morning. The weather was mild as they set up their gear by the water's edge. Both men were experienced and certified cave divers who had explored this site many times before. We all know that cave diving is much more dangerous than regular diving. It requires special equipment and training since divers enter enclosed spaces far from the surface. If something goes wrong, you can't just swim up to safety. The limited space, darkness, and distance from open air create risks that ordinary divers never face. Many cave divers say it's like exploring another planet, beautiful but completely unforgiving of mistakes. By 10 a.m., both men were ready. Their equipment included twin tanks holding compressed air, about 3,000 psi, regulators to breathe the air, powerful underwater lights, and guidelines, ropes that help divers find their way back. Cave diving equipment is more complex than regular scuba gear, with redundancy built into every critical system. This backup equipment can mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. The water was cold, around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, requiring them to wear thick protective dry suits. These suits keep water completely off the diver's body, unlike wetsuits that allow a thin layer of water to be warmed by body heat. As they descended into the quarry, sunlight faded quickly. Within moments, their world shrank to what their dive lights could illuminate, narrow beams cutting through the darkness. The underwater tunnels were created by miners years ago, who had no idea their workplace would someday become an underwater maze. Silt covered the floors, which could easily cloud the water if disturbed, making it impossible to see. Cave divers call this a silt out, and it's one of the most common dangers they face. One wrong kick or hand movement can trigger a cloud of fine particles that may take minutes or hours to settle. Following proper safety procedures, Gagnon and Weymouth used a permanent guideline in the main tunnel. This rope, attached to the walls, would lead them back to the entrance even in zero visibility. They went about 600 feet, 183 meters, into the quarry before reaching the end of this main line. For perspective, that's about twice the length of a football field, all underwater in nearly complete darkness. At this point, they used what's called a jump reel, a smaller line that connects to another permanent guideline, allowing them to explore a different tunnel safely. This technique prevents divers from getting lost in branching passages. After a short distance along this new path, they decided to turn back, perhaps noticing their air consumption or simply following their pre-planned dive schedule. During their return journey, disaster struck. Weymouth's main regulator failed and began free-flowing, meaning air was rushing out uncontrollably. At 109 feet, 33 meters underwater, this was extremely dangerous. A free-flowing regulator can empty a full tank in minutes, leaving a diver without air deep underground with no quick escape to the surface. Gagnon immediately followed emergency procedures, offering Weymouth his backup regulator on a long hose. This setup, known as a Hogarthian configuration in technical diving circles, allows divers to share air while maintaining proper positioning. It meant they could continue moving toward the exit, with Weymouth leading and Gagnon following closely behind. For a while, this emergency plan worked. They moved steadily along the guideline, about 2/3 of the way back. The tunnel was dark and narrow in places, requiring careful movement to avoid stirring up silt or bumping into the rocky ceiling or walls. Their dive lights created moving shadows that made distances difficult to judge. Then, about 400 feet, 122 meters from the entrance, Weymouth suddenly felt the air hose pulled from his mouth. The loss of his air source underwater would have triggered immediate panic in an inexperienced diver. With his own regulator still leaking but providing some air, Weymouth made the difficult decision to continue toward the exit, hoping Gagnon would follow. This choice, whether to turn back and search for his partner or continue to safety, likely took only seconds to make, but would have consequences that lasted forever. Weymouth surfaced alone, his tanks nearly empty with less than 500 psi remaining. For reference, many recreational divers consider 500 psi to be their absolute minimum reserve, the point at which they must end their dive immediately. There was no sign of Gagnon. Weymouth immediately called for help from shore, likely still hoping his partner had found another way out, or was making his way to the surface. His hands trembled as he removed his gear, eyes constantly scanning the water's surface for bubbles, or any sign of movement that might indicate Gagnon had found an alternative exit from the submerged labyrinth. Rescue divers arrived quickly and searched throughout the day, but couldn't find Gagnon. As hours passed, hope dimmed. Cave rescues are notoriously difficult. The same features that make caves challenging to explore make them equally challenging for rescuers. Visibility was further compromised as the search teams disturbed the delicate silt, creating clouds that reduced sight to mere inches in some areas. Despite using advanced sonar equipment and following the guideline meticulously, the rescue team found no trace of the missing diver as daylight faded. The next day, recovery divers found his body on the tunnel floor, about 400 feet from the entrance at a depth of 109 feet, 33 meters. He was positioned as if he had been attempting to follow the guideline, one hand still reaching forward. When examining Gagnon's equipment, investigators found something strange. One tank still had plenty of air, about 2,000 psi, but the valve connecting it to his breathing system was closed. Normally, this valve stays open during the entire dive. The presence of air in his tank made the tragedy even more puzzling and heartbreaking. Survival had been literally inches away, locked behind a closed valve. Fellow divers who knew Gagnon personally confirmed he was meticulous about equipment checks and had never previously experienced valve issues during his 15 years of technical diving experience. The discovery left the entire dive community questioning how such a fatal oversight could happen to someone with his expertise. Investigators believe that while focusing on helping his partner and navigating the low ceiling tunnel, Gagnon might have accidentally bumped his tank valve against the rocky ceiling, turning it off. The valve sits at the top of the tank, behind the diver's head, making it vulnerable to accidental contact with overhead surfaces. In the dark, confined space, he probably didn't realize right away why his air stopped flowing. The tunnel where he was found had several tight restrictions where the ceiling dropped significantly, forcing divers to adjust their trim and swimming position to pass through safely. Examination of his equipment showed slight scrape marks on the top of his tank, supporting the theory of accidental contact. At that depth, a diver without air can lose consciousness in less than a minute. The human body simply isn't designed to go without oxygen, and the increased pressure underwater accelerates the effects of oxygen deprivation. The distance to safety, combined with the difficult passage and emergency situation, created conditions that Gagnon couldn't overcome. Medical experts consulted after the recovery explained that at 109 feet, 33 meters, the partial pressure of oxygen in the bloodstream depletes rapidly when breathing stops. Even an experienced diver like Gagnon would have had only about 15 to 20 seconds of useful consciousness to identify and correct the problem before cognitive functions became severely impaired, making any self-rescue attempt nearly impossible in such challenging conditions. It was February of 2007 in the dense woodlands of North Florida, where crystal-clear springs punctuate the landscape like nature's portals to another realm, lies Allen Mill Pond Spring. To most visitors, it appears as just another serene water body nestled among the trees. But beneath its mirrored surface lies a labyrinthine underwater cave system that captured the imagination of one dedicated explorer for years. Ron Simmons, at 53, was no ordinary cave diver. A seasoned explorer with a meticulous approach to underwater cartography. He had devoted countless hours to mapping the hidden passages of Allen Mill Pond Spring. His passion for documenting these subterranean waterways wasn't merely a hobby, but a contribution to scientific understanding of Florida's unique hydrogeology. By Valentine's Day 2007, Ron had accumulated an impressive 2,524 feet, 769.6 meters, of survey data through his persistent exploration of this particular spring. His logbook recorded 43 previous dives at this location. Each entry represented hours spent underwater, patiently measuring passages, noting features, and drawing the intricate maze that few human eyes had ever witnessed. Allen Mill Pond Spring poses significant challenges even for experienced cave divers. The passages are notoriously silty, meaning that the slightest disturbance of the cave floor sends fine sediment into suspension, potentially reducing visibility to zero within seconds. The cave contains two maze-like conduits with multiple branches and connections, creating a three-dimensional puzzle beneath the earth. While the deepest section reaches 46 feet, 14 meters below the surface, most of the cave system remains at approximately 30 feet, 9.1 meters, deep. The confined spaces within the cave system necessitated specialized equipment. Standard scuba tanks worn on the back would make navigation through narrow restrictions impossible. Instead, Ron utilized side-mounted tanks, cylinders positioned along the sides of his body rather than on his back, allowing him to squeeze through tighter passages while maintaining redundant air supplies. February 14, 2007 began like many other days of exploration for Ron. He arrived at the spring early in the morning, parking his vehicle near a less frequented spring vent in a wooded area. The day was clear and pleasant. Perfect conditions for the underwater survey work he had planned. With practiced efficiency, he assembled his side mount configuration, checking each piece of equipment meticulously. His primary and backup lights, regulators, pressure gauges, and survey tools were all in perfect working order. Ron slipped beneath the water's surface shortly before 10 a.m. The crystalline water enveloped him as he descended toward the dark opening of the cave entrance. He paused briefly at the mouth of the cave, performing a final equipment check before venturing inward. The gentle flow of the spring created a subtle current against which he would swim on entry. Following his permanent guideline into the system, Ron navigated through the initial passages with practiced ease. These first 100 feet were familiar territory. He had passed through them dozens of times before. His powerful primary light cut through the darkness, illuminating the limestone formations and revealing the path ahead. At approximately 200 feet, 61 meters penetration, Ron reached a T-intersection he had documented previously. According to his survey plan for the day, he took the left passage, a branch of the maze he wanted to explore further. This tunnel narrowed considerably, requiring Ron to adjust his body position to navigate through without disturbing the silty bottom. The tunnel opened slightly after a tight restriction, revealing a chamber with several small offshoots. Ron began his systematic survey work here, measuring distances with a calibrated line, recording depths with his gauge, and sketching the passage dimensions on his underwater slate. This meticulous process continued as he moved deeper into the unmapped section. 3 hours into his dive, Ron had added 238 feet, 72.5 meters, of new survey data, a significant accomplishment in such challenging conditions. He had reached a depth of 28 feet, 8.5 meters, still well within the typical range for this cave system. It was at this point, approximately 300 feet, 91.4 meters from the entrance, that a critical situation developed. A check of his pressure gauges revealed a sudden and unexpected problem. His primary tank was depleting much faster than normal. Perhaps a slow leak had developed, or maybe the exertion of squeezing through multiple restrictions had increased his air consumption. Whatever the cause, the gauge reading was clear. He had insufficient air remaining for a safe exit. Ron immediately switched to his secondary tank, only to discover it contained less air than expected as well. The situation had become dire. Both tanks were critically low, and he was still far from the entrance. With nobody to share air with and no additional reserves, Ron faced the cave diver's worst nightmare, running out of air inside the maze. When Ron failed to surface after his expected return time, concern began to mount. Wes Skiles, another well-known figure in the cave diving community, contacted local law enforcement to check for Ron's vehicle at the main spring entrance, but nothing was found. The search expanded the following day, when Wes and Jill Heinerth, both respected cave divers themselves, located Ron's vehicle near the less obvious spring vent in the wooded area. The Lafayette County Sheriff's Office was notified immediately, and within 30 minutes, rescue and recovery personnel began arriving at the scene. The tranquil spring had transformed into a hub of emergency activity, with dive teams preparing for what they hoped would be a rescue operation. At 3:55 p.m. on February 15th, Mark Long entered the water for a reconnaissance dive. With experienced steady movements, he penetrated 650 feet, 198 meters, into the underwater cave system. After nearly an hour of searching through the crystal-clear water, turned occasionally murky by his passage, Mark returned to the surface without having located Ron. The search team reassessed their strategy. A careful review of Ron's work-in-progress map and notes revealed a critical insight. Mark had explored a different tunnel than the one Ron had likely chosen for his survey work that day. The maze-like nature of Allen Mill Pond Spring meant that searchers needed to understand Ron's intentions to effectively locate him. With renewed focus, Mark began a second dive at 5:06 p.m. This time, he followed the tunnel indicated in Ron's notes, marking the route with a guideline for potential follow-up divers. At 5:48 p.m., just 42 minutes later, Mark returned to the surface, but this time with Ron's lifeless body. He had made 43 successful dives in this very underwater cave. Who would have thought that his 44th would have been his last? The recovery revealed several telling details about Ron's final dive. He was found approximately 300 feet, 91.4 meters, from the entrance, positioned as if swimming. One regulator remained in his mouth, while a second trailed behind him, a standard safety configuration providing redundant air sources. Both of his tanks were empty. Data recovered from his equipment showed he had reached no deeper than 28 feet, 8.5 meters, below the surface during this final exploration. Perhaps most poignantly, Ron's survey notes showed he had documented 238 feet, 72.5 meters, of new passage on this trip. Even in what must have been increasingly dire circumstances, he had maintained his commitment to the work that defined his contributions to underwater cave exploration. As his air supply started running out, he began a controlled but urgent movement toward the exit, carefully conserving his remaining air by maintaining a relaxed breathing pattern indicated by his swimming position. As the minutes passed, Ron's air supply continued to diminish. He was moving efficiently through the maze, but racing against an unforgiving countdown. At some point during this desperate return journey, his primary tank emptied completely. Switching to his reserve, he continued toward the entrance, now with only the air in his secondary tank separating him from disaster. Approximately 300 feet from the entrance, Ron's second tank approached exhaustion. He maintained his swimming position, still moving deliberately toward safety, but the remaining air was simply insufficient for the distance. His final moments underwater were spent in continued forward motion. Even as the last of his air supply was consumed, he remained focused on the exit. The underwater caves of Florida are as unforgiving as they are beautiful. Despite extensive training and equipment redundancies, cave diving remains an activity where small problems can quickly escalate into life-threatening emergencies. Running out of breathing gas inside a cave represents one of the most feared scenarios in this specialized form of diving. On February 26, 2002, Travis Jenkins and Dale Fisher arrived at Cove Mine with standard open water diving equipment and minimal additional gear, each carrying just a single light source, basic diving masks, wetsuits, and standard scuba tanks. Neither possessed certification or formal training in cave or cavern diving, a highly specialized discipline with strict protocols and redundancy requirements developed specifically for the unique and unforgiving hazards of overhead environments where direct access to the surface is blocked. The absence of backup air supplies, redundant lighting systems, and cave-specific navigational tools would later be identified as critical factors in the tragedy that unfolded. Their regular open water training, while sufficient for lakes and oceans with unobstructed access to the surface, had not prepared them for the complex three-dimensional environment they were about to enter. The abandoned marble mine presented a deceptive environment that lured the divers into a false sense of security. Its large cathedral-like open chamber, with a seemingly tranquil pool of standing water, might have appeared similar to open water diving conditions. But beneath the surface lurked a treacherous network of flooded tunnels, narrow passages, and confusing side chambers. An overhead environment that demands specialized training, redundant equipment configurations, meticulous planning, and strict adherence to safety protocols developed over decades of hard-won experience in the cave diving community. The site's history as a marble extraction operation had left behind a complex labyrinth of human-made passages that intersected with natural karst formations, creating a particularly disorienting underwater maze that even experienced cave divers approached with caution. The two divers entered the water, with Jenkins handling a dive reel, a critical piece of equipment used to maintain a continuous guideline back to the entry point, serving as a lifeline in environments where visibility can rapidly deteriorate. They descended into the main pool within the large chamber, the solitary beam from their single lights cutting through the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the submerged rock formations. The water temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to affect judgment and manual dexterity during extended exposure, particularly in divers not wearing adequate thermal protection for prolonged immersion in such conditions. Inside the flooded mine, visibility was already compromised by fine sediment that naturally collects in such still, undisturbed waters. A mixture of marble dust from the mining operations and organic matter that had accumulated over decades. Even minor fin movements could stir this delicate sediment layer, rapidly reducing visibility from feet to inches, in a phenomenon cave divers call silt out. As they proceeded deeper into the submerged section of the mine, Jenkins paused briefly to address an issue with the dive reel, which had jammed due to improper spooling, a common problem for those unfamiliar with the specialized equipment. This momentary distraction, lasting perhaps only seconds, proved critical in the chain of events that followed, highlighting how quickly situations can deteriorate in environments that offer no margin for error. When Jenkins looked up again, after clearing the reel mechanism, Fisher was nowhere to be seen in the increasingly murky water. In the dim light, with rapidly deteriorating visibility caused by their own movements disturbing the fine sediment, visual contact had been lost between the diving partners. Jenkins searched the immediate area, but found no sign of his diving partner, calling out underwater and shining his light in different directions to no avail. The lack of a properly deployed continuous guideline meant that Fisher, if disoriented, had no tactile reference to follow back to the entry point, a fundamental safety protocol in overhead environment diving that had been compromised by the equipment malfunction. Outside the mine, Jenkins emerged alone from the water, visibly distressed and urgently seeking help from bystanders. He contacted emergency services via a cell phone kept in their vehicle, and rescue divers were quickly dispatched to the scene from neighboring counties with cave rescue capabilities. These professional cave rescue divers, trained specifically for such challenging environments and equipped with redundant air supplies, multiple light sources, and specialized equipment, faced significant challenges as they entered the water. The sediment disturbed by the earlier dive and subsequent search attempts had reduced visibility to near zero in many areas, forcing the rescuers to conduct a methodical, tactile search while maintaining constant contact with their own guidelines to ensure their safe return. Multiple search attempts were made throughout the day and into the evening, with rescue divers working in increasingly dangerous conditions to locate Fisher. The operation involved coordination between multiple agencies, including local fire departments, specialized cave rescue teams, and the county sheriff's office. Eventually, the search had to be temporarily suspended to allow the sediment time to settle, as continuing in zero visibility posed serious risks to the rescue divers themselves. A difficult decision that weighed heavily on the incident commander, but reflected the reality that additional lives could not be risked in conditions where effective search was impossible. When conditions improved slightly the following morning, rescue divers returned to the mine and eventually located Fisher's body in a narrow side tunnel branching off from the main chamber, approximately 130 feet from the entry point and at a depth of about 60 feet. He had somehow separated from Jenkins and entered one of the overhead passages, likely becoming disoriented in the low visibility and running out of air while attempting to find his way back to the main chamber. A tragic scenario that has claimed numerous divers in overhead environments where direct access to the surface is blocked by rock. In the aftermath, Travis Jenkins defended their preparation to local reporters gathered at the scene and in subsequent interviews. He claimed they had received verbal permission from the city of Jasper to explore and map the mine as part of a personal project to document abandoned mining sites in the region. More controversially, he maintained that they were properly trained and equipped for the dive, arguing that they hadn't been cave diving because they had only planned to explore the open pools rather than deliberately entering the tunnels. This distinction would become a central point of contention in the subsequent investigation and discussion within the diving community. Experienced cave divers and recovery personnel viewed these statements with concern and professional disagreement. The distinction Jenkins drew between diving in the open pools versus the tunnels overlooked a fundamental safety principle established through decades of similar incidents. Any dive in an overhead environment where direct vertical access to the surface is blocked falls under specialized cave or cavern diving protocols, requiring specific training, equipment, and procedures. The presence of a single light per diver rather than the minimum 3 recommended for overhead environments, the lack of redundant air supplies configured for independent function, the absence of continuous guidelines properly deployed, and most importantly, the absence of formal training in overhead environment procedures all pointed to a significant gap between the diver's preparation and the environment they chose to enter that February morning. The Cove Mine incident stands as a stark reminder of how quickly conditions can deteriorate in underwater environments, particularly when standard open water diving practices are applied to overhead settings with their unique challenges and hazards. Despite Jenkins' retrospective assurances that they weren't in over their heads, the outcome suggested otherwise. One experienced diver lost. Rescue personnel put at considerable risk during recovery operations, and a preventable tragedy that echoed through both the local community and the cave diving world for years to come. The incident was subsequently incorporated into cave diving training programs as a case study highlighting the importance of proper training, equipment configuration, and adherence to established protocols. The flooded passages of Cove Mine continue to hold their secrets, disturbed occasionally by properly trained exploration teams who enter with the equipment, training, and respect that such environments demand. Lessons purchased at the highest possible price by those who came before, and a silent testimony to the unforgiving nature of underwater exploration in overhead environments. The morning of August 14, 2001, dawned bright and warm in Montana. Summer vacation was winding down, and for the 5 teenagers gathered in the small town near Lick Creek, this was one of their last adventures before the school year began. Jennifer Rochelot, 19, was looking forward to her sophomore year of college. Today she was cave exploring with her younger sister Vanessa, 17, along with their friends Chris Castle, 19, his brother Andrew, 17, and Derek Lute, 17. They had planned the trip to Lick Creek Cave for weeks. The cave was popular among local teens, requiring no permits, and offering an accessible adventure in Montana's rugged landscape. The group had packed what they considered adequate equipment: flashlights, water bottles, snacks, and a knotted rope they'd found in Chris's garage. None of them had proper helmets, climbing harnesses, or the specialized equipment that experienced cavers would recognize as essential. Jennifer wore comfortable jeans and a gray cotton sweatshirt that her boyfriend had given her, clothing that felt practical for a summer day that would be spent mostly underground, where temperatures hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. By 10:30 a.m., they had parked their Jeep at the small dirt lot that served as the unofficial trailhead to Lick Creek Cave. They hiked the short trail to the cave entrance, excitement building with each step. Jennifer had been here once before, 2 summers ago, but for Vanessa, it was her first caving experience. Derek, who had trained as a medical specialist during his first summer with the National Guard, felt confident that his skills would keep everyone safe if trouble arose. The main entrance to Lick Creek Cave was a dark mouth in the limestone hillside, approximately 2 meters, 6.5 feet, tall, and 3 meters, 10 feet wide. Cool air rushed out to meet them as they switched on their flashlights and ducked inside. The limestone walls quickly closed in around them, and within minutes, the sunlight from the entrance had faded to a distant glow behind them. They moved deeper into the cave, about 90 meters, 295 feet from the entrance. They arrived at what regular visitors to Lick Creek Cave called the Drop, a 4.5 meter, 15-foot descent to the lower level of the cave system. Chris took out the knotted rope and secured it around a sturdy-looking limestone projection at the edge of the drop. He tugged on it several times to test its strength before tossing the rope down into the darkness. After a final check, Chris gripped the rope and began descending hand over hand, using the knots as footholds. When he reached the bottom safely, he gestured for the next person to follow. Jennifer volunteered, eager to prove her experience from her previous visit. She grasped the thin rope, which was only about 1 centimeter, 0.4 inches, in diameter, and began lowering herself carefully over the edge. The rope felt rough against her palms as she descended, her feet seeking the knots below, with her flashlight tucked into her jeans pocket. About halfway down, disaster struck. The loose-fitting sweatshirt Jennifer wore, given to her by her boyfriend, caught on one of the knots in the rope. She paused, trying to free the fabric with one hand, while maintaining her grip with the other. For a moment, she hung suspended in the darkness, her arms beginning to tremble with the strain of supporting her entire body weight of 61 kilograms, 134 pounds. Jennifer twisted her body, attempting to unhook her sweatshirt from the knot. The motion caused her to begin spinning slowly on the rope, her body turning in complete circles as she dangled helplessly 2.5 meters, 8 feet above the cave floor. The cave walls revolved around, intensifying her disorientation with each rotation. Her arms burned with the effort of holding on, fingers cramping against the thin rope as she continued to spin. While struggling to maintain her grip, her palms grew slick with sweat, her muscles trembling from exertion and fear. After nearly 30 seconds of desperately clinging to life, Jennifer's fingers, unable to maintain their hold on the rough rope, finally slipped. She fell through the darkness, her body twisting in the air as she plummeted face down toward the cave floor. During the 3-meter, 10-foot drop, her left shoulder violently struck a protruding rock jutting from the cave wall. The impact spun her body, flipping her over, so that when she finally struck the ground, she landed hard on her back on top of the jagged breakdown rocks below. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. It crashed through her body in waves, centered in her lower back and pelvis. Jennifer lay stunned on the cold cave floor, the wind knocked from her lungs, unable to make a sound. Above her, her sister's horrified gasp echoed off the cave walls. Chris was at her side in seconds. Jennifer was conscious but gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face as the initial shock gave way to excruciating pain. Her whispered words about the agony in her back were barely audible in the vast darkness of the cave. While Chris stayed with Jennifer, Vanessa, Andrew, and Derek scrambled to find an alternate route down, a small side passage that switched back down to the same level, allowing them to avoid the treacherous drop. Within minutes, they had joined Chris at Jennifer's side. Derek, drawing on his medical training, carefully assessed Jennifer's condition. He checked her vital signs and tested her responses methodically. Jennifer could feel when he touched her feet and hands, and could move her fingers and toes, crucial signs that her spinal cord might be intact despite her injuries. The pain was most intense in her lower back and pelvis, areas where Derek suspected serious damage had occurred. After completing his assessment, Derek consulted with the others. Though Jennifer had feeling and movement in her limbs, her injuries were clearly serious. The group faced a difficult decision: wait in the cave for professional help, or attempt to transport Jennifer out themselves. Given the remote location and the urgency of Jennifer's condition, they determined that moving her themselves was the best course of action, despite the risks involved. Chris, the strongest of the group at 82 kilograms, 180 pounds, carefully positioned himself to carry Jennifer on his back. With agonizing slowness, he began crawling toward the entrance, Jennifer clinging to him, every movement sending spasms of pain through her damaged spine and pelvis. Chris carried her out through the small passageways when the tunnel widened enough to stand, measuring about 1.5 meters, 5 feet in height. The others took turns helping to carry Jennifer. After nearly 2 hours of painstaking progress, they glimpsed daylight ahead. Emerging into the bright Montana afternoon, they carefully loaded Jennifer into the back of their Jeep. They drove to the hospital in Great Falls, some 80 kilometers, 50 miles away. At the emergency room, X-rays and detailed scans confirmed what Derek had suspected. Jennifer had suffered 5 fractured vertebrae and a severely fractured pelvis in her fall. She was rushed into surgery. Jennifer would spend the next 8 days in the hospital, followed by 3 months of intensive physical therapy. On December 31st, 1990, near Santa Rita Mountains, Kevin Sears and his friend were heading towards another adventure. At 21 years old, with several caves already explored, they felt confident about their return to Agua Caliente Cave on the last day of the year. The limestone formation, nestled in the western foothills south of Tucson, Arizona, had beckoned them back to explore its deeper passages. The weather was chilly, but both young men wore only jeans and short-sleeve shirts, anticipating the constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius temperature that awaited them underground. Their tennis shoes, though lacking the ankle support of the proper caving boots, had served them well enough on previous adventures. Each carried a flashlight, their only source of light. Wrapped around Kevin's shoulder hung 50 feet, about 15 meters, of half-inch polypropylene rope, essential for descending the vertical shaft, known among cave explorers as the loop pit. Neither wore helmets, despite the low ceilings and protruding rock formations that made head protection standard practice among experienced spelunkers. At 11 a.m., they ducked through the upper entrance, a narrow opening in the hillside barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. The passageway narrowed in places, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees over rough stone that scraped their unprotected limbs. Kevin and his friend had no formal map, but relied on memory from their previous exploration when they had traversed the loop, a circular route through the cave system, in the counterclockwise direction as far as the White Sand Room, a chamber named for its unusual floor of pale, fine sediment that resembled a miniature beach. Today they would attempt the clockwise route, planning to complete the full loop and exit through the lower entrance without needing to climb back up the way they came. 8 minutes of careful movement brought them to the loop pit, a vertical shaft dropping 40 feet, approximately 12 meters, to the lower level of the cave. They secured their rope to a natural anchor point, a sturdy rock protrusion, and performed a quick check by tugging firmly on it. With their rigging complete, they began their descent one at a time. Without proper rappelling gear, specialized equipment used cave explorers to control their descent on a rope. They lowered themselves hand over hand, a technique that requires considerable upper body strength and carries significant risk if the climber loses their grip. With the loop pit conquered, they continued their clockwise journey through narrow tunnels that occasionally widened into rooms large enough to stand upright. By 1 p.m., they had reached the White Sand Room, a chamber roughly 30 feet across with a ceiling just high enough to stand. The fine, pale sediment crunched beneath their shoes as they swept their flashlights around, searching for the passage they had used during their previous visit. Minutes stretched into a half hour as they explored every crevice and opening they could find. But the familiar route eluded them. The similarity of rock formations and the disorienting nature of underground navigation had confused them. As they ventured deeper, they felt as if they were ending back to the starting point. Everything seemed uncannily similar. The tunnel would narrow down, then widen up into a room, and then this would keep on happening. They started to panic and could feel they were lost. However, the only thing that kept them hopeful was that they were going in one direction only and followed one passage only. Eventually, they were forced to acknowledge defeat. Their plan to complete the loop had failed, meaning they would need to return the way they came, back up the rope at the loop pit. With growing concern about the time, now 1:30 p.m., they retraced their steps. The journey back to the pit took longer than expected as fatigue began to set in. They still didn't know if they were going back to the pit or were actually lost. But they stayed calm and followed their gut. Their flashlights, which had seemed bright upon entry, now appeared dimmer as their batteries gradually depleted. Finally, a sense of relief came in as they were able to recognize the loop pit. Now, all they had to do was climb up and get out. At the base of the loop pit, Kevin prepared for the ascent. Looking up at the distant circle of darkness that marked the upper level, he gripped the rope firmly and began pulling himself upward, hand over hand, foot by foot. He climbed slowly through the darkness. The rough polypropylene fibers bit into his palms as sweat began to make his grip uncertain. Nearly at the top, with muscles burning from exertion, Kevin encountered a section of the pit wall covered in flowstone, a smooth, hard mineral deposit created by water flowing over the surface over thousands of years. His tennis shoes, with their flexible rubber soles now coated in cave dust, found no purchase on the slick surface. For a moment, he hung suspended by the strength in his arms alone. Then, his grip failed. The fall lasted only seconds, but time seemed to stretch as Kevin plummeted through the darkness. Instinctively, he wrapped his arms around his head for protection as he crashed onto the cave floor. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, but left him otherwise intact. He was in pain, but after catching his breath and assessing that no serious damage had been done, Kevin approached the rope once more, determined to conquer the obstacle. Again he climbed, arms trembling now with fatigue and the after effects of adrenaline. Again he reached the treacherous flowstone section, and again, despite his careful movements, his feet slipped from beneath him. This time, as he fell, something went terribly wrong. He landed awkwardly, a searing pain exploding through his leg and hip. The cave's dusty floor pressed against his cheek as waves of agony washed over him. Each attempt to stand sent fresh bolts of pain through his body. His femur, the large bone in the upper leg, and possibly his pelvis had fractured from the impact. Immobilized by injury and trapped hundreds of feet from the surface, Kevin faced a cave explorer's nightmare. His friend, realizing the severity of the situation, made the difficult decision to leave Kevin alone while he sought help. The solo ascent up the rope was arduous, but fear and urgency lent him strength. Emerging from the cave into the afternoon sunshine felt surreal after the close darkness below. The nearest telephone lay miles away across rugged terrain. It was nearly 3 p.m. when the emergency call was finally placed, setting in motion the complex machinery of cave rescue. The Southern Arizona Rescue Association, SARA, received a notification at 7 p.m., and locals with knowledge of Agua Caliente began arriving at the scene between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m. As darkness fell outside, cave rescuers, trained volunteers skilled in the specialized techniques required for underground emergencies, descended into Agua Caliente. They found Kevin conscious but in extreme pain, having lain injured in the complete darkness for hours after his flashlight batteries had failed. The rescue team's first priority was medical assessment and stabilization. They carefully secured Kevin to a backboard to immobilize his spine and potential fractures. An intravenous line was inserted to provide fluids, though no pain medication, food, or water was administered due to the uncertainty of his injuries and the potential need for emergency surgery upon reaching the hospital. Extracting an injured person from a cave presents unique challenges unlike those of surface rescues. The team had to rig 4 separate hauling systems, mechanical advantage setups using ropes and pulleys, to overcome the vertical obstacles between Kevin and the surface. These included the 40-foot loop pit where the accident occurred, the climb into what was called the register room, named for a logbook kept there for visitors to sign, the awkwardly angled beer can slide, and finally the climb out through the lower entrance. Throughout nearly the entire route, Kevin was belayed, secured with safety lines to prevent any further falls, as rescuers painstakingly transported him through narrow passages never designed for human transit, much less for moving an immobilized person on a rigid backboard. At 11:15 p.m., nearly 12 hours after entering the cave, Kevin was hauled upward through the loop pit, where his ordeal had begun. At the top, he was transferred to a Stokes litter, a specialized basket stretcher designed for difficult evacuations, and the slow process continued. As the final minutes of the year ticked away, rescuers worked tirelessly in the confined spaces, communicating through shouts that echoed off limestone walls. The night air held a biting chill when Kevin finally emerged from the lower entrance at 2 a.m. on New Year's Day. Under normal circumstances, the cave's constant temperature would have been comfortably warm compared to the winter night, but hypothermia had become a concern due to Kevin's immobility and the trauma his body had endured. 30 minutes later, Kevin was airlifted to the University Medical Center. There, doctors were surprised to discover that despite the excruciating pain and apparent injury, no bones were actually broken. His body was battered with abrasions and contusions, bruises and scrapes from his falls and the rescue, but he had miraculously avoided fractures. On August 17, 1997, at around 8 p.m., 2 experienced cave divers prepared for what would become one of the most tragic incidents in the history of Bahamian blue hole exploration. Rob Parker, 35, had built his reputation exploring the deepest underwater caverns in the Caribbean. With over 1,000 log dives spanning 2 decades, he was recognized among the elite community of technical cave divers. His diving partner, Dan Malone, possessed similar credentials and shared Parker's passion for mapping the unknown passages that honeycomb the limestone foundations of the Bahamas. Four Sharks' Blue Hole Cave represented the ultimate challenge, a vertical shaft plunging beyond 300 feet, 91 meters, into the Earth's crust, with passages that had never been fully explored. Their mission was ambitious: penetrate up to 1,200 feet, 366 meters, into the cave system while conducting a detailed survey, spending 40 minutes at depths reaching 250 feet, 76 meters. The mathematics of such a dive were complex and unforgiving. At 250 feet, nitrogen narcosis, the intoxicating effect of breathing compressed nitrogen under extreme pressure, would impair judgment like alcohol consumption. Every minute spent at such depths would require careful decompression during ascent to prevent potentially fatal decompression sickness. Both divers carried multiple gas cylinders containing different breathing mixtures calculated for specific depth ranges. Near the cave entrance at 30 feet, 9 meters, they staged cylinders containing enriched air nitrox 80 and pure oxygen for decompression stops. At 120 feet, 37 meters deep, and 300 feet, 91 meters from the entrance, they reached the target fissure and staged additional cylinders containing enriched air nitrox 36. The fissure was a vertical fracture measuring just 2 feet, 0.6 meters, wide at its entrance, demanding respect. Its walls pressed close together for a 30-foot, 9-meter restriction that required divers to remove equipment and squeeze through sideways. Water temperature dropped to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius, in the depths. A permanent guideline, installed by previous explorers, disappeared into the darkness like a thread leading into a labyrinth. 8 minutes into their penetration, at 220 feet, 67 meters depth, both divers switched from compressed air to trimix, a breathing gas containing 15% oxygen, 40% helium, and 45% nitrogen. The helium replaced some nitrogen to reduce narcotic effects at extreme depth, allowing clearer thinking and better motor control. At the 12-minute mark, they reached the end of the existing guideline. Malone attached a new reel and began laying fresh line into unexplored territory. The passage opened dramatically, 15 to 20 feet, 4.6 to 6.1 meters wide with no visible floor. They were now pioneers, swimming where no human had ever ventured. 20 minutes into the dive, they had pushed the boundaries as far as their gas supplies safely allowed. Following established protocols, they had consumed 1/3 of their breathing gas, the remaining 2/3 needed for exit and emergency reserves. During the survey work back toward the main line, disaster struck quietly. The regulator on one of Malone's trimix cylinders failed, ceasing to deliver breathing gas. Malone maintained composure, switching to his backup cylinder without panic. However, following ingrained emergency protocols, he should have immediately signaled Parker about the equipment failure. In the stress of the moment and narcotic haze affecting judgment at depth, he chose to continue without communicating the problem. This decision would prove fateful. Beginning their ascent, they planned to switch back to compressed air at 220 feet, 67 meters. However, Malone's equipment failure forced him to consume his remaining trimix faster than anticipated. At 250 feet, 76 meters, he ran out of the helium mixture and switched to air, 30 feet, 9 meters, deeper than planned and well within the danger zone for severe nitrogen narcosis. Parker, unaware of his partner's predicament, switched to air at the planned 220-foot, 67-meter depth. They communicated briefly, though nitrogen narcosis at such depths impaired their judgment like alcohol intoxication. At 220 feet breathing air, the partial pressure of nitrogen reached levels equivalent to consuming multiple alcoholic drinks. Swimming in single file with Parker leading, they navigated back toward the main cavern. The guideline led them under a massive boulder, requiring careful maneuvering in confined space. As they ascended to approximately 180 feet, 55 meters, Malone noticed something alarming. Parker had begun to sink, despite apparently still breathing normally. At extreme depths, nitrogen narcosis could cause complete disorientation and loss of motor control, while the victim remained technically conscious. Parker, despite his vast experience, was succumbing to the intoxicating effects of breathing compressed air at crushing depths. Malone reacted instantly, swimming after his sinking partner and grabbing Parker's ankle at approximately 230 feet, 70 meters depth. In the darkness, with both divers now deeper than safe air-breathing limits, Malone faced a life-or-death rescue situation. Grabbing Parker by his buoyancy compensator, Malone began the exhausting process of towing his unconscious partner upward. The physical demands were enormous. At 230 feet depth, water pressure exceeded 100 pounds per square inch, 6.9 bar, more than 6 times sea level pressure. Swimming while towing another fully equipped diver required tremendous effort, and Malone's powerful fin kicks generated enough force to tear both fins from his feet, leaving him to propel himself and Parker with hands and arms alone. Using his power inflator to add air to both their buoyancy compensators, Malone managed to tow Parker back up to the guideline. The exertion left him breathing heavily, consuming his remaining air supply at an accelerated rate. Back at the guideline, Parker regained consciousness. The ascent to shallower depth had reduced nitrogen pressure enough to restore some awareness, though he remained impaired. He began swimming independently, following the line back towards safety. The guideline led to another restriction, a narrow passage that could be navigated above or below the line. Parker chose to swim approximately 1 foot, 0.3 meters above the line, while Malone entered just below it. This separation would prove tragic, as neither diver could directly assist the other in the confines. By this point, Malone's air supply had dropped to a critical 300 psi, 20.7 bar, barely enough breathing gas to reach his stage decompression cylinders. When last seen, Parker appeared to be negotiating the restriction successfully, swimming under his own power. Malone proceeded through the narrow passage, pulling himself along the guideline through confining walls. Fighting exhaustion and air starvation, he emerged and reached his stage decompression cylinder at 120 feet, 37 meters depth in the main cavern. Taking 2 desperate breaths from the nitrox cylinder, Malone immediately turned back toward the fissure entrance. His underwater light beam penetrated the darkness, searching for Parker's lights. The restriction should have taken only minutes to navigate, but Parker had not emerged. After waiting 5 agonizing minutes, Malone faced the devastating realization that his partner was not coming out. Swimming into the main cavern, Malone located support divers Tom Iliff and Gene Flipse. Using underwater slate and hand signals, he communicated the crisis. Parker was missing in the fissure system. Malone began the mandatory 3 hours and 20 minutes of decompression required after his deep, long dive. Each minute felt like hours, knowing Parker was somewhere in the dark fissure. The recovery operation began 2 days later, on August 19th. Brian Kokuk led the team along with Malone, Stephanie Schwabe, and Tom Iliff. They found Rob Parker 149 feet, 45 meters, deep in a vertical restriction, measuring just 24 to 30 inches, 61 to 76 centimeters, wide. He was positioned head down, facing back into the cave, evidence that he had become disoriented and attempted to swim deeper rather than towards safety. Due to the confined space, they could not access Parker's pressure gauge. The recovery required removing his equipment to maneuver his body through the narrow passage, a grim operation conducted 149 feet underwater in near total darkness. Moving the body 175 feet, 53 meters through the fissure to the main cavern required careful coordination between all 4 recovery divers. No autopsy was performed, but circumstances clearly indicated nitrogen narcosis as the primary cause of death. Despite Parker's impressive credentials, he had been relatively inactive in recent years. His logbook showed several dives in the 2 weeks preceding August 17th, but none to the extreme depths encountered in Foreshark's blue hole. This detail proved crucial. Nitrogen narcosis tolerance varies with recent exposure. Divers who regularly work at extreme depths develop some adaptation, while those diving in shallower water become more susceptible. Parker's decade of reduced activity, combined with the stress of the situation, created conditions where even an expert could succumb to nitrogen's intoxicating effects. The morning of August 5th, 1997, had begun like any perfect Hawaiian day. Clear skies, gentle trade winds, and temperatures hovering around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. Timothy Anderson had met Wynton Nicholson through a mutual friend earlier in the week, and the local had offered to show him some off-the-beaten-path locations that most tourists never discovered. The sea caves along Keauhu's coastline were precisely such an attraction. From a distance, the entrance to the sea cave appeared like a gaping mouth in the black cliff face, approximately 15 feet, 4.6 meters high at its tallest point. A narrow ledge of volcanic rock formed a natural pathway leading inside, though it required careful footing to navigate. Wynton, having explored this cave several times before, led the way. Timothy followed closely behind. The cool shadows of the cave provided welcome relief from the tropical heat as they ventured deeper inside. The different layers of lava flow had created unique patterns in the rock walls, where the darker areas represented newer volcanic material. What neither of them adequately noticed was the gradually changing rhythm of the waves. Had they checked the local forecasts that morning, they might have seen the high surf advisory issued for the Kona coast, a warning about a distant storm system generating larger than normal swells. Local knowledge would have told them that August often brought unpredictable ocean conditions to this part of the island. Instead, they ventured farther inside, reaching a point where the cave floor descended to meet a pool of seawater that surged gently with each incoming wave. Winton suggested they pause here to capture some photos. It seemed perfect. Timothy carefully positioned himself near the edge, about 2 feet, 60 centimeters, above the water's surface, to capture the perfect shot of the cave's interior. Neither noticed the sudden decrease in the ambient roar, that moment of unnatural quiet that experienced oceangoers recognize as the precursor to an especially large set of waves. The first warning came too late, a strange sucking sound as the water in the pool suddenly receded, dropping several feet below its previous level. Winton had just enough time to shout a warning before an incoming wave headed their way, far larger than any they had witnessed since entering. The wave crashed into the cave with explosive force, sending water surging towards them at frightening speed. The shelf where they stood, previously safely above the waterline, was instantly submerged under 3 feet, 91 centimeters, of churning ocean. The force knocked both young men off their feet, sweeping them off. Timothy experienced a moment of pure disorientation as he found himself suddenly underwater, tumbling helplessly in the grip of the powerful surge. His shoulder slammed painfully against a submerged rock, followed by his head hitting another rock. Winton, more experienced with ocean conditions, managed to grab a protruding rock formation as the initial surge hit. He caught a glimpse of Timothy's flailing form being pulled toward the cave entrance by the powerful backwash of the retreating wave. Releasing his handhold, Winton allowed himself to be carried by the same current, knowing their best chance of survival lay in escaping the cave before the next wave hit. The retreating water ejected them from the cave mouth with alarming speed, carrying them over the sharp volcanic rocks that had earlier served as their entrance path. Timothy felt the sting as the rough surface tore at his skin, leaving a trail of abrasions across his legs and arms. More concerning was the sickening impact when his head struck a protruding rock. The momentary relief of being out of the cave was quickly replaced by a new danger. They were now in open water, being pulled away from shore by the powerful retreating wave. The next wave in the set was already visible, a rolling swell approaching with frightening speed. Winton told Timothy they needed to get to shore before the next wave hit. Timothy, fighting through the fog of his head injury, responded instinctively to the urgency in Winton's voice. Both men swam desperately toward the nearest shoreline, fighting against the current that tried to pull them farther out to sea. The approaching wave grew taller as it neared, its face steepening from gentle swell to towering wall of water. Winton, gauging its approach, made a split-second decision that likely saved both their lives. He instructed Timothy to dive and go under the wave. Years of surfing had taught him that diving beneath an unbroken wave was safer than being caught in its breaking face. Both men took deep breaths and plunged beneath the surface just as the wave passed overhead. The turbulence still tossed them about like rag dolls, but they avoided the worst of its crushing force. When they resurfaced, gasping for air, they found themselves closer to shore. The wave's energy had actually helped push them toward land. Both men were exhausted but had managed to reach a point where they could allow the white water to push them the final distance to shore. The relief of feeling solid ground beneath their feet was overwhelming but short-lived. They had reached shore, but not the beach they had started from. Instead, they found themselves at the base of a sheer cliff face that rose approximately 40 feet, 12.2 meters, above them. The narrow strip of black sand and rock where they stood was no more than 10 feet, 3 meters wide, and would completely disappear at high tide. They were effectively trapped between the vertical cliff and the unpredictable ocean that had just demonstrated its lethal potential. Exposure now became their enemy. Despite Hawaii's tropical climate, being soaked in the persistent trade winds led to a dangerous lowering of body temperature. The sun had passed its zenith and would soon disappear behind the cliff, leaving them in shadow. Timothy, still dazed from his head injury, began showing early signs of shock: pale skin, confused responses, and uncontrollable shivering. Winton knew they needed to act quickly. First, he tore strips from his own shirt to create a makeshift bandage for Timothy's head wound, applying pressure to stem the bleeding. Next, he helped position Timothy against the cliff face where they would have some protection from the wind. Using what little dry sand he could gather, he created a slight barrier between them and the damp ground to minimize further heat loss. Their salvation came in the form of another tourist, a woman hiking along the cliff top who happened to glance down and spot two figures on the otherwise deserted shoreline. Recognizing their distress, she immediately called emergency services. Within 30 minutes, the wail of police sirens could be heard approaching on the road above. The rescue operation unfolded. The Hawaii Fire Department's specialized cliff rescue team arrived alongside police units and paramedics. Using ropes and harnesses, rescuers descended the cliff face to reach the stranded men. Timothy, whose condition had deteriorated further, was secured in a specialized basket stretcher and hoisted up the cliff. Winton, though exhausted and suffering from multiple lacerations, was able to ascend using a harness with the guidance of the rescue personnel. At the cliff top, ambulances waited to transport both men to Kona Community Hospital. Hours later, Winton was officially discharged after being treated for his cuts and abrasions. His worry for Timothy had not subsided, even with the assurances from the medical staff that the teenager was in stable condition. The CT scan had revealed a mild concussion, but thankfully no bleeding within the skull, a diagnosis that had allowed Winton to release a breath he felt he'd been holding since they were first swept from the cave. The next day, Timothy made a full recovery and was discharged. The morning of October 7th, 2001 began like many autumn Sundays in upstate New York. Gage Caverns is a natural limestone cave system located near Schoharie, New York, which has long attracted explorers eager to witness its underground wonders. 5 friends, Edward Galbavy, Kevin Shaw, Shioku Kudo, Adam Dobson, and J.J. Bradingham, arrived at the cave entrance around 10:30 in the morning. They were a mix of experienced spelunkers and newcomers, all drawn by the thrill of exploring the underground world. Gage Caverns was well known among local cave explorers, featuring both wet passages containing underground streams and dry sections where water had long since carved out spaces before moving elsewhere. The group had carefully prepared for their excursion. Each person carried a helmet with a mounted light, backup flashlights, extra batteries, some water, and light snacks. They wore clothes that could get dirty: old jeans, long-sleeve shirts, and sturdy boots with good traction for the slippery cave surfaces. More experienced members of the group carried small packs with emergency supplies, including a basic first aid kit. Before entering, they checked their equipment one last time and signed the cave register, a common safety practice that lets others know who is inside and when they should return. The October air was chilly, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. But they knew the cave would maintain a steady temperature of about 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, year-round. At approximately 11 a.m., they entered the cave through its main opening, a dark gap in the hillside that seemed to swallow the daylight. The entrance chamber was large enough for all 5 to stand comfortably, but as they moved deeper, the passages began to narrow. The group decided to explore the dry side of the cave first. This included a challenging section called the Balls Down Crawl, named for the uncomfortable but necessary technique of crawling with your body lying flat against the ground. The passage was so tight in places that they had to exhale to make their chests smaller just to squeeze through. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. They took photographs and pointed out interesting features to one another. Around 1 p.m., they made their way back to a larger room known as the amphitheater, a spacious chamber where several passages meet. Here, they paused to rest, have a snack, and decide where to explore next. The amphitheater was impressive, about the size of a small classroom with a ceiling high enough to stand up straight. Several small openings led off in different directions, some barely visible as dark cracks in the walls. These unexplored side passages caught their interest. Shioku Kudo, a 28-year-old graduate student who had been caving only a few times before, was particularly curious about a narrow horizontal crack that seemed to lead to another chamber. The crack was about 2 feet, 60 centimeters wide, and perhaps 18 inches, 45 centimeters tall, large enough that a person might be able to squeeze through while lying on their side. Kudo, being smaller than the others, volunteered to check if the passage went anywhere interesting. The others watched as she lay down on her side and began inching into the narrow opening. The trouble began almost immediately. The passage didn't continue straight ahead as it appeared from the outside. Instead, it bent sharply to the right at a 90-degree angle just beyond where they could see from the entrance. As Kudo pushed forward, she had to twist her body to follow this unexpected turn. She managed to get her upper body through the bend, with her torso now pointing in one direction, while her legs extended straight back in the original direction she had entered, forming a 90-degree angle with her body. This awkward position quickly became dangerous. The crevice narrowed even further, just beyond the bend, pinching inward at exactly the spot where Kudo's ribcage now rested. As she tried to push forward or pull back, she found herself completely stuck. The rock pressed painfully against her ribs, preventing her from moving in either direction. The rough limestone edges dug into her sides, and the tight space restricted her breathing. Kudo was stuck. She called out to her friends, trying to keep her voice calm despite the growing panic she felt. Kevin Shaw and Edward Galbavy immediately came to help. They tried to guide her, suggesting different positions and movements that might free her. They tried pulling gently on her feet, then pushing on her shoulders, but nothing worked. The more she struggled, the more firmly wedged she became. The tight bend had created a natural trap, like a hook that easily catches but doesn't easily release. The painful reality of Kudo's situation soon became clear. Her body was bent sideways at more than a 90-degree angle, with her ribcage compressed against the unforgiving stone. Every breath was difficult and painful. She couldn't expand her chest normally, forcing her to take shallow breaths. Worse still, she couldn't move her arms into a position that would give her any leverage to push herself free. After many unsuccessful attempts to free her, the group realized they needed help. The cave's cool temperature, constant at around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, posed an additional danger. With Kudo unable to move, her body temperature would slowly drop, potentially leading to hypothermia. Shaw volunteered to leave the cave and call for professional help, while the others stayed with Kudo to keep her spirits up and monitor her condition. Shaw made his way quickly through the cave, emerging into the afternoon sunlight around 1:30 p.m. He immediately contacted emergency services, explaining the situation and giving details about Kudo's location within the cave. Soon, local rescue teams were notified, including specialized cave rescue units and emergency medical technicians. Meanwhile, back in the darkness of the amphitheater, Kudo's situation was growing more uncomfortable by the minute. The pressure on her ribcage made each breath painful. The hard stone floor beneath her side numbed her arm and hip. Worst of all was the psychological stress, the darkness, the tight space, and the growing uncertainty about whether she could be freed all contributed to rising anxiety. The first rescuers began arriving at the cave entrance around 2:15 p.m. They carried specialized equipment designed for cave rescues: ropes, harnesses, communication devices, medical supplies, and tools for removing rock. They quickly organized into teams and began making their way to the amphitheater, where Kudo remained trapped. By 3 p.m., the first rescue team reached Kudo. A paramedic immediately checked her vital signs. Kudo had now been trapped for nearly 2 hours, and the effects were showing. Her lips had a bluish tint from the cold and restricted breathing, and she was shivering despite her efforts to remain calm. The rescue team's first attempts followed the same approaches that her friends had tried: different angles of pulling and pushing, lubricants to reduce friction, and gentle rocking motions to try to free her body from the crevice. However, the peculiar angle of her entrapment, with her torso bent sideways at more than 90 degrees and her ribs compressed by the narrowing passage, made these conventional rescue techniques ineffective. As the afternoon stretched into evening, more specialized rescuers arrived. Some had experience with similar cave rescues and brought additional equipment. They set up bright lights to better assess the situation and established a communication system to coordinate their efforts. By 5 p.m., Kudo had been trapped for nearly 4 hours, and concern was growing about her physical condition. The pain in her ribs had become nearly unbearable, and the cold was sapping her strength. Around 7:20 p.m., 2 experienced cave rescuers, Joe Armstrong and Ken Fortuin, arrived with specialized equipment, including small drills and chisels designed for removing rock in tight spaces. They recognized that the only way to free Kudo would be to carefully remove some of the rock that was trapping her. This process was slow and dangerous. Armstrong and Fortuyn had to work in the cramped space, careful not to cause any rock falls or create dust that would make breathing even more difficult. They identified key points where removing small sections of rock would relieve the pressure on Kudo's body without compromising the stability of the surrounding cave. For over 90 minutes, they carefully drilled and chipped away at the rock. Each small piece removed provided a tiny bit more space. Throughout this ordeal, Kudo remained conscious but grew increasingly exhausted. She had now been trapped in her painful position for about 8 hours, twisted sideways with her ribs compressed and her breathing restricted. Finally, at just after 9 p.m., Armstrong and Fortuyn removed enough rock that Kudo could be slowly eased out of the crevice. As she was freed, the pain of blood rushing back into her compressed tissues was intense. Rescue medics immediately wrapped her in warming blankets and began treating her for hypothermia and compression injuries. Her ribs were badly bruised, and she had lost feeling in parts of her side that had been pressed against the rock for hours. Rather than rushing her out of the cave, the rescue team allowed Kudo to rest and recover her strength for about an hour. They gave her warm fluids and monitored her condition closely. When she felt strong enough to move, they slowly helped her through the cave passages, supporting her every step of the way. At 10:20 p.m., almost 9.5 hours after becoming trapped, Shioku Kudo emerged from Gage Caverns into the cool night air. Waiting ambulance personnel immediately took her to a local hospital for further evaluation and treatment. Remarkably, despite her ordeal, she had suffered no permanent injuries, just severe bruising, temporary nerve compression, and the psychological impact of her frightening experience. In the aftermath, local caving experts like Tom Engel noted that there had been some confusion during the early stages of the rescue regarding how long Kudo had been trapped, potentially delaying the full-scale rescue response. He emphasized the importance of calling for help quickly in cave emergencies, recommending that if a trapped caver cannot be freed within about 15 minutes, outside help should be summoned immediately. The temperature in southeastern Kentucky hovered just above freezing on February 13, 1994. Along a winding road near Lake Cumberland, 3 teenagers from Cincinnati prepared to enter the Sloan's Valley cave system. Brandon Conlin, Joe Van Eaton, and Daniel Hume, all 18, had driven 3 hours from their homes to explore this natural wonder. A sprawling underground maze stretching for miles beneath the forested hills. None possessed caving experience. Their equipment consisted of a single flashlight, regular clothes, and enthusiasm. No helmets to protect against low ceilings, no backup lights, no food, no additional layers against the constant 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, temperature that prevails year-round in Kentucky caves. The 3 entered the cave mouth together, leaving the winter day for the underground darkness. After less than 30 minutes, Daniel Hume abruptly decided to leave, citing a bad feeling about the cave. Brandon and Joe continued deeper, stating they would exit in about 2 hours. Daniel emerged into the winter afternoon alone. Inside the cave, Brandon and Joe pressed forward, excited by the limestone formations and the thrill of exploration. The single beam of their flashlight cast moving shadows as they ventured deeper into the twisting passages. Each new chamber and corridor drew them further into the labyrinth, their inexperience preventing them from marking their route or tracking time properly. Outside, Daniel returned to the car and turned on the heater. He reclined the seat slightly and stared at the cave entrance. 2 hours passed. The winter sun set. No sign of Brandon or Joe. Inside, the 2 explorers realized they had lost track of their path. The passages looked increasingly similar, smooth in some places, jagged in others, but without distinguishing landmarks their untrained eyes could recognize. They turned back, or what they thought was back, moving with growing concern through passages that seemed unfamiliar. 3 hours after their entry, darkness fell over the Kentucky hills. Daniel remained in the car, occasionally stepping toward the cave entrance, calling out once, then returning to the warmth of the vehicle. He made no move toward the nearby road to flag down passing cars. His phone remained in his pocket, unused. Inside, Brandon and Joe began to worry. Their planned 2-hour exploration had clearly run long. The passages continued to confuse them, each choice at a junction, seeming right, but leading to unfamiliar terrain. They took comfort in one certainty. Daniel knew where they were. Surely he would call for help if they didn't return soon. The night passed. Morning came. Daniel Hume woke in the reclined driver's seat, condensation covering the windows. He wiped a small circle clear and watched the cave entrance from a distance. He got out to stretch, walked a small circuit around the car, then returned to his seat. He did not call for assistance. He did not seek help from nearby residents. He made no effort to contact authorities. Deep in the cave, Brandon and Joe faced a growing crisis. Their single flashlight flickered and dimmed as the batteries failed. In its dying light, they sought a recognizable passage but found only more confusion. Then darkness. Complete, absolute darkness, unlike anything they had experienced before. They could not see their hands before their faces. They called out, their voices echoing through unseen chambers. They felt their way along walls, trying to retrace their steps, but the complex branching of the cave defeated their efforts. Cold began to seep into their bodies. Without movement, the 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, temperature of the cave gradually chilled them. They huddled together for warmth, still believing rescue would come soon. Daniel would have surely called for help by now. People would be coming. A second night fell outside. The temperature dropped further. Rain began to fall, turning to sleet in the early hours. Daniel occasionally woke in the car, adjusted his position, and returned to sleep. As he later reported, he was mostly sleeping in the car through this entire period. For over 30 hours, as his friends remained lost in darkness, he took no action to secure help. No 911 call, no attempt to find assistance. In the perpetual night of the cave, Brandon and Joe had lost all sense of time. Hours stretched indistinguishably. They were hungry, thirsty, and increasingly weak. The cold had settled deep in their bodies, making movement difficult. They stayed in one place now, conserving energy, calling out periodically in hopes of being heard. Their hope for rescue remained fixed on Daniel. He knew where they were. He would bring help. This certainty kept them from panic, even as their situation deteriorated. On what was now the second day since their disappearance, hunger drove Daniel to a local store. There, he casually mentioned to the clerk that he was waiting for friends still in the cave. His detached manner raised concerns among bystanders who recognized the potential danger. When a local learned the teenagers had been underground since the day before yesterday, they immediately called 911. The rescue operation mobilized quickly. Local cavers with knowledge of the system joined first responders. They entered with proper equipment: helmets with headlamps, backup lights, first aid supplies, food, water, and communications gear. Inside the cave, Brandon and Joe heard distant sounds. At first, they thought it might be their minds playing tricks after so many hours in silence and darkness. Then the sounds grew clearer. Voices, multiple voices, calling their names. Light appeared in the distance, moving closer. Their ordeal was ending. Less than 2 hours into the search, approximately 400 feet, 122 meters from the entrance, rescuers discovered the teenagers. They were huddled together, confused, weakened by hunger and dehydration. They had endured over 30 hours in complete darkness, sustained only by their certainty that Daniel would eventually bring help. The rescuers provided food and water. After resting briefly, Brandon and Joe walked out under their own power. They emerged into daylight, squinting, eyes unaccustomed to brightness after so long in darkness. Daniel Hume stood nearby, watching the rescue operation with the same detachment he had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. When questioned about his failure to report his friends missing, Hume's response proved perplexing. "I didn't want to bring a bunch of people out to search and then they would come out." As if the inconvenience of a false alarm outweighed potentially fatal consequences of inaction. The incident became the subject of local discussion. Some saw merely teenage poor judgment, 3 unprepared young men making increasingly bad decisions. Others detected something troubling in Daniel's behavior. a callous indifference to his friend's welfare, or perhaps something darker? Why had he left the cave so quickly? Why make no effort to seek help, despite knowing his friends were many hours overdue? What had he actually been doing during those 2 days he claimed to be mostly sleeping in the car? Brandon and Joe learned the full story only after their rescue, that Daniel had simply waited, mostly sleeping, making no effort to find help. Their expressions as they absorbed this information spoke volumes. The realization that their faith in their friend had been misplaced, that their rescue came not through his actions but through the chance concern of strangers, changed something fundamental in their understanding of friendship and trust. Investigators found no evidence of criminal intent, and no charges were filed. Brandon and Joe recovered physically, though friends reported they seemed altered by more than just time lost in darkness. The incident faded from headlines, becoming another cautionary tale about cave exploration without preparation. But among cavers and locals, questions persisted about those February days. Questions about friendship, responsibility, and the strange behavior of a young man who knew his friends were exploring a dangerous cave system inadequately equipped, then failed to act when disaster struck. Sloan's Valley Cave continues its silent existence, indifferent to human dramas within its passages. Its darkness conceals not only formations created over millennia, but also, perhaps, the true answer to what happened during those 40 hours, and why a friend remained silent while time ran out. In years since, Daniel Hume, Brandon Conlon, and Joe Van Eaton have separated. None returned to Sloan's Valley Cave. Local cavers occasionally find solitary footprints leading to the entrance, stopping at the threshold where daylight fades before turning away, as if someone has revisited the scene, considered entering once more, and reconsidered. Whether these are footprints of someone seeking answers or someone hiding from questions remains, like much else in this story, shrouded in darkness. On 9th April 2005, a young man named Richard Harness led an expedition of 12 eager children in the depths of one of the most notorious caves known as the Devil's Den Cave. At 20 years old, Richard believed himself experienced enough to guide this school field trip through the underground labyrinth beneath the Ozark Mountains. His previous visits to the cave system had given him confidence, perhaps too much of it. While Richard briefed the children, Melissa Jones, another instructor, remained outside as she waited for another group of children to lead later in the day. The temperature outside hovered around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. But within the limestone passages, a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, awaited them, cool enough to slowly sap body heat over hours of exposure. The children, ranging from 8 to 12 years old, moved excitedly as they donned their helmets and switched on their flashlights. None of them had been in a wild cave before. Their only experiences with underground spaces were commercial show caves with paved walkways and electric lighting. Richard carried a small backpack with water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and extra batteries, standard preparations for a trip planned to last only 3 hours. What he hadn't accounted for was how his body had changed since his last expedition 6 months earlier. The 15 pounds, 6.8 kilograms, he'd gained during winter seemed insignificant when he volunteered to lead this adventure. By 11:30 a.m., the group had navigated through a series of increasingly challenging horizontal passages. The children's small frames allowed them to move with relative ease through tight spaces, where Richard had to exhale fully and contort his body to pass. Each successful navigation built a false sense of security. Their path led them to a particularly daunting obstacle, a vertical fissure, barely 10 inches, 25 centimeters wide, but extending upward about 6 feet, 1.8 meters. This narrow crack connected 2 horizontal passages in the cave system. Through his flashlight beam, Richard could see that the passage beyond was slightly larger, just enough space for someone of his stature to crawl on hands and knees. Richard mentally referred to this as a room, though it was merely a slightly more accommodating tunnel. His memory from previous explorations told him this space continued onward to more impressive portions of the cave. The fissure appeared passable, and Richard recalled traversing it before. He made a critical decision. He would send the children through first while he supervised, then follow them into the horizontal passage beyond. Through the beam of his light, he could see this passage on the other side, tantalizingly close yet separated by the narrow vertical slot of limestone. One by one, the young explorers turned sideways and slipped through the narrow opening, their small bodies compressing as they navigated the tightest sections. Some made noises of discomfort as cold stone pressed against their ribs and spines, but all 12 eventually emerged into the horizontal passage beyond. Their excited movements were visible through the crack as they crawled forward on hands and knees into the space Richard had remembered, their flashlight beams dancing along the low ceiling. Richard turned sideways and began his own entry into the crack. Immediately, the unforgiving stone gripped him more tightly than he remembered, his chest pressed against one wall, his spine against the other. Still, he pushed forward, sucking in his stomach and inching deeper into the fissure. Halfway through, progress stopped. The passage narrowed imperceptibly, but enough that his hips, wider than his chest by several crucial centimeters, wouldn't pass through. He attempted to retreat, but found himself caught at an angle that made backward movement impossible. The rock held him in a vice-like grip, compressing his chest and restricting his breathing. The realization struck with terrifying clarity. He was completely stuck, wedged in solid limestone, with 12 children now trapped beyond his reach in the horizontal passage. The initial terror was overwhelming. Richard's heart hammered against the confining stone as pure primal fear flooded his system. His breathing, already restricted by the pressure on his chest, came in short, panicked gasps. In that moment, the full weight of his responsibility crashed down upon him. 12 children, none older than 12, were now cut off from safety because of his miscalculation. He had led them into danger, and now his own body formed the barrier that prevented their escape. On the other side of the fissure, the children's excitement transformed instantly into horror. Their young faces, once excited, contorted with fear as they watched their guide become trapped in solid rock. Some froze in place, paralyzed by the sudden turn of events. Others began to cry silently. The older children, processing the situation more quickly, crawled toward the fissure to assess Richard's condition. Through the narrow opening, they could see him suspended in the vertical crack, unable to move forward or backward. The sight of their adult protector helplessly pinned between walls of limestone shattered their sense of security. If Richard couldn't save himself, who would save them? Outside the cave, Melissa Jones checked her watch. The group wasn't due to return until 3 p.m., more than 3 hours away. Unaware of the emergency unfolding beneath the earth, she sat in the warm spring sunshine, occasionally glancing toward the cave entrance, expecting nothing but an on-time return. Inside, the first half hour passed in a blur of desperate attempts. Each movement only seemed to wedge him more firmly in place. His hips, slightly wider than he remembered from his last visit, formed an immovable anchor in the narrowest part of the fissure. The children watched in growing dismay as their guide's struggles proved futile. They could only watch as Richard's movements grew weaker, his breath more labored. By the 1 hour mark, the immediate panic had given way to a more insidious danger. The temperature in the cave began its slow assault on their bodies. Without movement to generate warmth, they all started to shiver. Richard, although in a desperate situation, still gave out instructions. He told them all to huddle together in order to fight the coldness inside the cave. For Richard, the physical situation deteriorated rapidly. His suspended legs, dangling below the point where he was wedged, began to tingle as circulation was compromised. The first signs of compression syndrome, a potentially fatal condition caused by prolonged pressure cutting off blood flow to tissues, were setting in. At the 2 hour mark, conditions inside the cave worsened substantially. The limited air supply in the confined space began to change in composition, as 12 children and 1 trapped adult consumed oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. The first sign of this deterioration came as headaches developed among the group. Then followed dizziness and nausea, the body's warning systems responding to the shifting atmospheric chemistry. Outside, unaware of the life-threatening situation developing below ground, Melissa Jones continued her wait. The appointed return time was still hours away. No help would be summoned until the group was officially overdue. By the 3rd hour, several children had become dangerously still. The children's water supply, meant for a short recreational trip, was already half consumed. Dehydration would soon compound the effects of the cold exposure, accelerating the drop in body temperature. Two of the youngest had fallen asleep, despite the older children's efforts to keep them awake. This surrender to sleep was not benign rest, but a dangerous symptom of advancing hypothermia. At 3 p.m., the appointed return time passed with no sign of the group. Melissa Jones, now concerned, alerted park rangers about the overdue of the expedition. The search began, but precious hours had already elapsed, hours during which the trapped adventurers' conditions had deteriorated toward criticality. When rescuers finally located the group, they were in shock. Richard wedged tightly, almost out of strength, in the narrow vertical fissure between two horizontal passages. 12 kids, trapped beyond him with no way of reaching them, or even giving them supplies before getting Richard out of the way. The rescuers' initial attempts to free Richard proved disastrously ineffective. Park rangers and local firefighters without specialized cave rescue training attacked the stone with sledgehammers and chisels, attempting to break away enough rock to free him. The violent impact sent shockwaves through the limestone, threatening to destabilize the very fissure holding Richard. One ranger suffered a broken hand from a missed hammer strike, highlighting the dangers of improvised techniques in the confined space. 2 hours into the rescue attempt, the Washington County Search and Rescue Team arrived with proper cave rescue training. They immediately recognized the futility of trying to alter the stone and instead focused on Richard himself. They determined that cutting away his restricting clothing and shifting his body upward slightly might allow him to pass through a marginally wider section of the fissure. Using tubular webbing, strong flat nylon straps used in climbing and rescue operations, they fashioned slings that could be worked under Richard's arms. With careful coordination, they lifted him just inches higher in the crack, where the opening was slightly wider. Simultaneously, they cut away his blue jeans, removing the extra bulk that contributed to his entrapment. After 5 hours wedged between unyielding stone, Richard was finally extracted. The return of blood flow to his compressed tissues brought excruciating pain, like thousands of needles stabbing simultaneously into every cell. While Richard was carried out of the cave, the rescuers rushed towards the children and checked their condition. They needed immediate medical care, so one by one, they were taken out of the fissure, starting with those most in need of medical assistance. The experienced cave rescue team worked methodically, carrying each child through the tight passage that had trapped Richard until all 12 were out. Outside the cave, emergency medical personnel immediately treated the young explorers for hypothermia. 2 of them, the youngest ones, were immediately rushed to the hospital. Though visibly shaken by their ordeal, most of the children responded well to the initial treatment, and subsequently all of them were transported to the local hospital for thorough examination, where doctors confirmed no lasting physical damage had occurred. Though able to leave the cave under his own power, more from adrenaline than physical capability, the ordeal left Richard with lasting physical and psychological damage. For the children, the nightmare of being trapped beyond reach of help, watching their only guide and protector suspended helplessly in stone, would manifest in dreams for years to come. The incident report later emphasized that compression syndrome, hypothermia, dehydration, and oxygen deprivation had nearly claimed 13 lives that day. It also highlighted a crucial lesson. Emergency personnel without specific cave rescue training often underestimate the complexity of extraction from confined spaces and delay calling for specialized help. A potentially fatal mistake measured in minutes of oxygen, degrees of body temperature, and millimeters of rock. Devil's Den had nearly added 13 names to its dark history, not through malevolence, but through the simple, implacable physics of stone and flesh, and the overconfidence of a young man who didn't realize how little margin for error exists hundreds of feet below the Earth's surface, where the darkness is absolute and the stone has waited millions of years for human folly. The evening of December 18th, 2004, settled quietly over the hamlet of Madiran in southwestern France. Jean-Luc Josouat Verges, a 48-year-old caretaker at a local health center, left his home without saying much to his wife and 14-year-old son. Depression had been his constant companion for months, wrapping around his thoughts like a dark fog. He climbed into his Land Rover, tucking a bottle of whiskey and a pocket full of sleeping pills into his jacket, and drove up into the limestone hills that overlooked the village. As twilight faded into darkness, Jean-Luc steered his vehicle toward the gaping entrance of an abandoned mushroom farm built into underground caves. He sat for a moment in the silence, then clicked on his flashlight and stepped out, leaving the driver's door open behind him. He stumbled forward, carrying whiskey in one hand, into the underground caverns, an endless tunnel leading to underground caves. The abandoned farm wasn't simply a single cavern, but a sprawling underground labyrinth. Originally excavated as a chalk mine, the tunnel stretched for approximately 8 kilometers, 5 miles beneath the hills. A disorienting maze of blind corridors, twisting passages, and dead ends carved into the limestone. Jean-Luc walked deeper into the darkness, turning left, then right, with no particular destination in mind. Without a map or any guidance system, he was completely lost within minutes. The underground tunnels were so identical in their appearance that, when he tried to turn back, he had no way of knowing if he was retracing his steps or venturing deeper into the maze. Within hours, the batteries in his flashlight began to fail. The beam grew dimmer with each passing minute until it finally sputtered out, plunging him into absolute darkness. Without light, Jean-Luc's sense of direction immediately vanished. He continued forward, hands outstretched, feeling his way along the cold, damp walls. The ground beneath his feet grew increasingly soggy as he progressed through one particularly muddy corridor. The earth became a thick morass that clung to his shoes, creating a powerful suction. When he attempted to take another step, both shoes were pulled completely off his feet, swallowed by the mud with a soft, imperceptible sound. Now barefoot, Jean-Luc continued to stumble through the absolute darkness. The temperature in the caves remained a constant 12 degrees Celsius, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to be uncomfortable for a man without proper clothing or shelter. His fingers trailed along the rough limestone walls as he searched for any hint of the exit. Each corridor led to another, identical in their darkness, indistinguishable in their twists and turns. Jean-Luc frequently thought he recognized a particular bend or texture in the wall, believing he had returned to a previous location, only to discover he was in yet another unfamiliar section of the maze. This false familiarity was cruelly deceiving. While he believed he might be circling back toward the entrance, he was actually venturing deeper into the bowels of the underground network. During those first 24 hours, Jean-Luc's initial confusion transformed into rising panic. The human hippocampus, that primitive region of the brain, equipped with millions of neurons designed to create cognitive maps of our surroundings, was rendered useless in the absolute darkness. Without visual cues or landmarks, his brain's navigation equipment failed completely. His sense of time began to distort as well. With no daylight to mark the passing of hours, the feeling of being hopelessly lost intensified with each step. What made his situation particularly maddening was the sensation that he was traveling in circles, yet every attempt to course correct only seemed to lead him deeper into the underground labyrinth. By the third day, hunger and thirst became Jean-Luc's primary concerns. His whiskey was gone, and he had never swallowed the sleeping pills. Desperately thirsty, he discovered that water occasionally dripped from the limestone ceiling. He positioned himself beneath these natural faucets, catching precious drops on his tongue. When the dripping was too slow, he pressed his mouth directly against the cave walls, sucking moisture from the porous stone. His stomach cramped with emptiness. After nearly a week underground, Jean-Luc began to adapt to his circumstances. Crawling on all fours through the darkness, he pawed at the ground like an animal, finding substances he could consume. He ate clay from the tunnel floor and gnawed on pieces of rotten wood left behind by the mushroom farmers. The material was barely digestible, but it quieted the gnawing pain in his stomach. Sleep came fitfully in this lightless world. Jean-Luc discovered old plastic tarpaulins abandoned by the mushroom farmers and wrapped himself in them for warmth, creating a nest in a relatively dry corner of the maze. Without the rhythms of day and night, his sleep patterns became erratic. Sometimes he would curl up for what felt like minutes, only to wake feeling as though days had passed. Other times he would wander for hours in a half-conscious state, uncertain if he was dreaming or awake. As the days stretched into weeks, Jean-Luc's psychological state underwent remarkable transformations. At times, despair would overwhelm him completely. During one particularly dark period, perhaps 2 weeks into his ordeal, though time had lost all meaning, he found a piece of rope left behind by the mushroom farmers. With methodical care, he fashioned it into a noose, in case things got unbearable. He kept this last resort with him as he continued his endless wandering. Yet, strangely, Jean-Luc also experienced unexpected moments of profound calm. As his mind adapted to the absolute disorientation, he sometimes slipped into meditative states, allowing his thoughts to soften and unravel. Instead of fighting against the darkness and confusion, he surrendered to it. In these moments, he floated through the tunnels in peaceful detachment, singing softly to himself, his voice echoing through the empty chambers. By the fourth week, Jean-Luc's body had undergone dramatic changes. His once robust frame had withered to skeletal thinness, with his 75-kilogram, 165-pound body losing nearly a third of its weight. His fingernails had grown long and broken from constant scraping against stone walls. A beard had sprouted from his face, growing to several inches in length, scraggly and untrimmed. His bare feet had hardened into calloused pads, adapted to the rough tunnel floors. His world had contracted to the immediate space around him. The reach of his arms, the sound of dripping water, the feel of the walls beneath his palms, the outside world with its sunlight, open spaces, and human connections had become abstract, almost mythological. In this sensory deprivation, his mind created its own realities. Sometimes he would hallucinate voices or glimpses of light where none existed. On January 21st, 2005, exactly 34 days after Jean-Luc first entered the tunnels, 3 teenage boys from the village decided to explore the abandoned mushroom farm. Just a few meters into the entrance corridor, they discovered the Land Rover, its driver's door still standing open, exactly as Jean-Luc had left it over a month earlier. Alarmed by this strange sight, the boys immediately contacted the police. Authorities dispatched a search team, which entered the labyrinth with powerful lights and proper equipment. After 90 minutes of methodical searching in a chamber just 180 meters, 600 feet, from the entrance, they found Jean-Luc Josua Verges. He was ghost pale from the absence of sunlight, emaciated to the point of being skeletal, and had grown a long, wild beard. But remarkably, he was alive. The team carefully extracted Jean-Luc from the tunnels and rushed him to the nearest hospital. Doctors were astonished by his condition. Despite severe dehydration and malnutrition, he had no life-threatening injuries. The human body's remarkable ability to adapt had allowed him to survive on minimal sustenance in an environment that should have been fatal within days. News of Jean-Luc's survival quickly spread through French media outlets. Reporters dubbed him Le Miracle des Ténèbres, the miracle of darkness. His story captivated the public, rivaling even the most dramatic tales of survival by mountain climbers or shipwreck victims. When he was well enough to speak, Jean-Luc recounted the details of his ordeal: the clay and rotten wood diet, the water sucked from cave walls, the plastic tarpaulin bedding. What fascinated psychologists and journalists alike were Jean-Luc's descriptions of his mental states during the ordeal. The human brain, when stripped of its ability to navigate and deprived of sensory input, had responded in unexpected ways. His oscillations between despair, deep enough to contemplate suicide, and meditative calm, profound enough to find peace in absolute darkness, highlighted the brain's remarkable plasticity. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans have relied on our powerful hippocampus to create cognitive maps of our surroundings. This navigation equipment, far more sophisticated than our modern lifestyle requires, is a biological inheritance from our nomadic ancestors, for whom getting lost meant certain death. When Jean-Luc's brain encountered an environment where this equipment was rendered useless, the lightless, featureless maze of the tunnels, it initially responded with panic, then adaptation, and finally with altered states of consciousness. Jean-Luc's experience demonstrated that when humans lose their bearings completely, the brain can either spiral into terror or, paradoxically, discover unusual freedom. Off the coast of Croatia sits Shulta Island, only 19 kilometers long by 5 kilometers wide. This tiny island is a short ferry ride and an ideal day trip from Split, which is Croatia's second biggest city. It's a hilly island with beautiful pebble beaches and absolutely crystal clear water. It's a very popular tourist destination that's actually famous for its honey, as well as an underwater cave that kills virtually everyone who goes inside. On September 10th, 2002, 31-year-old Miroslav Kukas was enjoying a vacation with friends on Shulta Island. It was a little after 8:30 in the evening when one of his friends suggested they go scuba diving. Because of its beautiful clear waters, Schulte Island is a very popular scuba diving destination, and as such, scuba diving takes place at all hours around the island. The vast majority of diving happens in safe little alcoves where it's not very deep, and you can see fish and wildlife in a very controlled environment. But Miroslav and his friends didn't want to do regular scuba diving. They wanted to check out the underwater cave they had heard about, just south of Schulte Island in Pogan Bay. They had heard this cave was extremely dangerous, and only expert divers were allowed to go in there. Even though they were not expert divers, barely novice divers, they thought, how bad can it be? Let's go check it out for ourselves. So, they convinced one of the boat drivers to take them out to the area in Pogan Bay that sat over where this cave entrance was. They put on their gear, hopped in his boat, drove out, and jumped in the water. Sure enough, right below the surface, about 10 meters down, was this hole on the seafloor, the single entrance into this cave. When you go in this hole, you have to go down head first because it's so tight. Once you go down about 10 meters, you reach this junction where, to one side, it leads to the shallow gallery, which is the space that goes down to 36 meters with no other caves or entrances off of it. It's just kind of like a chasm inside of the cave. From the junction, if you go the other way, it brings you to the deep gallery, which is just a bigger version of the shallow gallery and goes down to 57 meters. Inside the deep gallery, however, at the very top on the ceiling, there is a very thin air pocket. There are several reasons why this cave is so dangerous beyond just being an underwater cave, which in itself is quite dangerous. The first is that visibility inside the cave is basically zero. The only light that comes in is through that single entrance that leads to the junction, but the light doesn't make it past the junction into the two galleries. So it is truly pitch black inside those galleries. You also have all the silt that's caked to the inside of the cave, so as soon as you get in there, your flippers and your movement kick the silt off the wall and muddy the water around you. Even if you had a flashlight, it's like driving in fog. The lights only pick up the fog right in front of you. You can't see beyond the fog. In a tunnel, you shine your light on silt, and you're just going to see the silt, not beyond it. So basically, going into this cave, you're going to be blindfolded. A little after 9:15 p.m., Miroslav goes in first, followed by his other two friends. Miroslav reaches the junction, and he turns towards the deep gallery. He goes all the way down to 57 meters, touches the bottom, turns around, and starts making his ascent. On the way up, he gets to the junction and makes the critical mistake of going into the shallow gallery, believing that is the exit of the cave. He probably got in there, bumped his head, started feeling around. He's kicking up silt, he's starting to panic, he's looking for the way out. Again, he finds the exit to the junction, but instead of taking the exit out of the cave, he makes the same mistake again and goes into the deep gallery. Now he's in the deep gallery, feeling around, running low on air. Based on his dive computer, he was fumbling around in there for quite some time. At some point, Miroslav must have looked at his air gauge and realized, I'm out of air now, and he made one last push to try to get to the surface, but he hit a ceiling. That's when he realized, based on maybe the touch and feel, maybe he took his gloves off and was feeling around. He felt that he was in the air pocket, that thin amount of air that sat right at the top of the deep gallery. He must have realized at this point that there was so little air here that he probably only had a few minutes before he was going to drown. In terms of making his ascent to the surface on a single breath, Miroslav's only hope was the air pocket in the deep gallery. He likely knew the cave well enough to remember this. In his mind, he was probably estimating his depth, 40, maybe 50 meters beneath the surface, and realizing just how little oxygen he had left in his lungs. Every second, his chest was tightening. The crushing pressure of the water and the mounting carbon dioxide in his system would have been pushing his body into panic. He couldn't stay where he was, and he couldn't make the journey upward without blacking out. The thought of drowning, thrashing helplessly as water filled his lungs, was becoming inevitable. Faced with that terrifying certainty, he made a decision no diver ever wants to consider. With the clarity that sometimes comes in the final moments, Miroslav reached for the dive knife strapped to his gear. He gripped it, steeled himself, and drove it into his chest, piercing his heart. It was quick. Later, when authorities performed his autopsy, it would confirm the unthinkable truth. Miroslav did not drown. He had died by his own hand, choosing it over the slow agony of suffocation. Back on the surface, the two other divers in his group had already exited the cave system without issue. They were in the boat, waiting, scanning the surface of the water for signs of Miroslav. Time ticked by, 10 minutes, 20, then 30. After over an hour had passed with no sign of him, their concern turned to fear. They called the police, who responded quickly and sent 2 trained cave divers into the submerged tunnel system to search for Miroslav. One of those divers was 25-year-old Oliver Mirage, a capable and physically fit professional, but not yet experienced with this particular cave's notorious layout. He and his partner descended into the dark, narrow corridors, their lights cutting through the silty water as they searched for any sign of Miroslav. But the cave was a labyrinth, and visibility was poor. With time and oxygen running low, they prepared to abort the mission and ascend. But as they made their way out, Oliver misjudged the route, just like Miroslav had before him, and became disoriented in the network of underwater chambers. Specifically, he became trapped in the shallow gallery, a deceptive area that leads many divers to think they're close to escape. His partner had made the same mistake briefly, but had managed to reverse course and find the correct exit path. Oliver, however, was not so fortunate. He went back and forth in desperation between the deep gallery and the shallow gallery, trying to orient himself, but every wrong turn brought him closer to exhaustion. In the end, he couldn't find his way out. His tank ran dry, and Oliver Mirage drowned in the same cave where Miroslav had died just hours before. It would take the police 3 long days to locate and recover both Miroslav and Oliver from the twisted passages of that cave. By then, the story had made headlines, and the site gained a grim reputation. Even today, local authorities actively warn divers to stay away from this cave unless they have extensive experience with deep, technical diving and the mental discipline to handle extreme stress. Despite the warnings, year after year, reckless or overconfident divers still try to test their luck. And tragically, many make the same fatal mistakes, misjudging the galleries, running out of air, and becoming yet another name in a growing list of victims claimed by the cave. Under a gray January sky in Perry County, Missouri, Don Biddle drove along the muddy back roads toward a promising sinkhole near Mystery Cave. The date was January 9th, 1993, a Saturday that would soon test the limits of human endurance. The week prior had seen torrential rainfall, nearly 5 inches, 127 millimeters, across the county, saturating the limestone karst that honeycombed the region below its thin soil cover. Biddle parked his vehicle at the forest edge and gathered his equipment: headlamp, backup flashlight, digging tools, water, and a thermos of hot coffee. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, or 3.3 degrees Celsius, not dangerously cold, but cool enough to sap warmth from wet clothing. He wore thermal underwear beneath a waterproof oversuit, standard precautions for winter caving. His breath formed small clouds as he hiked the quarter mile, 0.4 kilometers, to his dig site. The sinkhole that had captured Biddle's attention was modest by Perry County standards, approximately 6 feet, 1.8 meters wide, and 12 feet, 3.7 meters long, with a depth of 12 feet, 3.7 meters. Its walls dropped vertically at the narrow ends while overhanging precariously at the wider sections. What made this particular depression significant was the small opening Biddle had previously uncovered at its bottom, potentially leading to an undiscovered cave system beneath. Perry County was already famous among spelunkers for harboring some of the longest cave systems in the United States, with over 700 documented caves. Each new discovery was a triumph in the tight-knit caving community. When Biddle arrived at 12 p.m., disappointment awaited. The week's heavy rainfall had completely undone his previous efforts. The small opening had collapsed and slumped mud filled the excavation area. But Biddle was determined. Working methodically with his trenching tool, he began removing the saturated clay and limestone fragments, piling the debris along the sinkhole's sloped edges. The work was physically demanding, and sweat soon dampened his thermal layer despite the cool air. For 3 hours, he made steady progress, occasionally pausing to sip from his thermos. At approximately 3 p.m., as Biddle crouched to examine what might have been the reappearance of the opening, disaster struck without warning. The accumulated mud and rock that he had been depositing on the slopes suddenly subsided, cascading down in a thick flow that engulfed him to his waist in seconds. The initial shock of the cold, wet mass against his body was quickly replaced by the alarming realization that he was trapped. The dense clay, over 100 pounds, 45 kilograms, per cubic foot, gripped his lower body with unyielding suction. Maintaining his composure, Biddle attempted to dig himself free. 5 separate times he managed to clear material down to his knees, but each effort was futile. The suction force of the clay, combined with the steady slumping of additional material, thwarted every attempt. Each movement seemed to make his situation worse as the disturbed earth settled more firmly around his legs. The light began to fade as winter's short day waned. Between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m., the situation deteriorated dramatically. Rain began to fall again, a steady, penetrating precipitation that slowly accumulated in the depression. The water level in the sinkhole began to rise at a rate of approximately 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, every 15 minutes. Biddle's calculations were grimly simple. At this rate, the water would reach his head within 6 to 7 hours. As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.1 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia became a genuine concern as the water level rose to Biddle's midsection by 7 p.m. The thermal underwear that had served him well during work now became a liability as it soaked through, conducting heat away from his core. His body temperature, normally maintained at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, began a slow, dangerous decline. Meanwhile, at their home 30 miles, 48 kilometers away, Biddle's wife grew increasingly concerned. Dawn had promised to return by 7 p.m., and he was meticulous about such matters. By 8 p.m., with no sign of her husband and no answer on his mobile phone, reception was notoriously poor in the cave-rich region. She began making calls. The first was to a local restaurant frequented by cave explorers, hoping Dawn had signed the logbook there. There was no entry. By 9:15 p.m., worry turned to action. She called experienced cave explorers, Steve Taylor and Gene Kraka, who recognized the potential seriousness of the situation immediately. Within 20 minutes, they had assembled emergency gear and were en route to Perry County, with Biddle's wife directing them to the approximate location of Dawn's dig. Back in the sinkhole, Biddle faced the growing certainty of his mortality. The water had reached his chest, and his extremities had grown numb, an early sign of hypothermia. His core temperature had likely dropped to about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, and rational thought became increasingly difficult to maintain. Still, he periodically called out, his voice echoing weakly across the dark forest. With each passing hour, the chance of rescue diminished. He tried to prepare himself mentally for death, cycling through memories of family and contemplating what awaited beyond. The search party arrived at the forest edge around 10:30 p.m. They quickly located Biddle's vehicle, confirming he was still in the area. Armed with high-powered flashlights cutting through the darkness and steady rainfall, they ventured into the forest. Navigating by memory and intuition, Biddle's wife directed them across approximately 40 acres, 16 hectares, of woodland pockmarked with numerous sinkholes and depressions. The rain intensified to 0.2 inches, 5 millimeters per hour, reducing visibility and adding urgency to their search. At 10:45 p.m., Biddle's wife thought she heard something, a faint human sound barely audible above the rainfall. They paused, straining to listen, and then changed direction toward the sound. Minutes later, a definite shout reached them. They called back, their voices carrying hope through the rainy darkness, and quickened their pace. At 11 p.m., their flashlight beams finally illuminated the horrifying scene. Don Biddle, after 8 hours of entrapment, was now submerged to his neck in muddy water. His breathing was labored and wheezing, his face pale in the harsh light. His arms remained free, though his hands were grotesquely swollen from hours of desperate digging, the fingertips abraded raw from clawing at the clay. A length of webbing was tied around his waist, secured to a nearby tree, a final precaution he had taken to prevent himself from slipping completely underwater when exhaustion finally overcame him. Despite his dire condition, Biddle was moderately aware, as Taylor would later report, conscious enough to recognize his rescuers, but convinced his situation was hopeless. His core temperature had likely dropped to approximately 92 degrees Fahrenheit, 33.3 degrees Celsius, a dangerously low level where cardiac arrhythmias become a significant risk. Two rescuers immediately headed back to their vehicle for equipment, while one stayed with Biddle, giving him coffee from his own thermos and attempting to warm his face with the heat from a carbide lamp. The sinkhole had become a nightmarish scene, 12 feet, 3.7 meters deep, with steep sides now slick with rain and mud, and a bottom filled with water slowly rising toward the victim's chin. When the equipment arrived, they rigged a cable ladder for safer access and established a Z-rig mechanical advantage system, anchored to a sturdy oak tree. Using webbing looped under Biddle's armpits, they attempted to pull him free. Despite a mechanical advantage that multiplied their force by 3 times, Biddle remained firmly trapped. The suction of the clay and weight of the saturated material, estimated at over 600 pounds, 272 kilograms, proved immovable. With the water still rising at an alarming rate, one rescuer left to call the Perryville Volunteer Fire Department from the nearest gas station. By midnight, emergency responders began arriving at the scene, bringing more equipment but soon realizing the specialized nature of the rescue. Their water pump, which could move 500 gallons, 1,893 liters, per minute, couldn't be used due to the deadly exhaust fumes it would produce in the confined space. The solution was decidedly low-tech. Buckets, dozens of them, passed hand-to-hand up a human chain. Every gallon, 3.8 liters, of water weighed approximately 8.3 pounds, 3.8 kilograms, making the work physically demanding. Chemical heat packs were placed against Biddle's neck and torso in an attempt to slow his declining core temperature. By 2 a.m., after 2 hours of relentless bailing, the water level had been lowered to Biddle's chest. This allowed rescuers to access more of the material trapping his lower body. Working in the 33 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.6 degrees Celsius water, they systematically removed rocks and clay from around his legs, their own extremities growing numb, despite frequent rotation of personnel. At 3:30 a.m., with Biddle's legs partially freed, and using the combined strength of 8 rescuers pulling on ropes attached to his harness, they felt the first movement. Minutes later, with a final coordinated heave, Biddle's body suddenly broke free from the clay's grip. Nearly 13 hours after becoming trapped, Don Biddle was finally pulled from the sinkhole. Wrapped in thermal blankets and secured to a backboard, Biddle was transported across 800 yards, 732 meters, of muddy terrain by ATV to a waiting ambulance. At the emergency room, medical personnel recorded his core temperature, and he was found out to be suffering from severe hypothermia. Miraculously, he had no permanent damage, only bruises, minor frostbite on his extremities, abraded fingertips, a small facial burn from the heat of the carbide lamp, and a sprained ankle. He was treated and would make a full recovery few days later. Biddle himself would later acknowledge his errors in judgment, working alone, ignoring the warning signs of the previous collapse, and continuing to pile excavated material on unstable slopes. Yet his survival against overwhelming odds also highlighted the critical importance of 2 factors: informing someone of your location and expected return time, and the remarkable human capacity to endure when hope seems lost.